and welcome everybody to today's final session of the case Marketing Communications track, which has been kindly sponsored by SMRS. And today I'm delighted to be introducing colleagues from SMRS to talk about the student journey. So today we have Ed Layt, who is Head of Consultancy at SMRS, and also Tim Landucci, who's the Education Marketing Consultant in SMRS as well. They're going to talk to us about the student journey and where we need to start, what we need to think about, how we could be prioritising, but they're also going to be sharing some reflections of the changes they've seen over the last 8 months and the impact that working through a global pandemic and working remotely and perhaps shifting to pretty much everything being digital has had on the student journey. And they're going to be looking at some of their recent experiences, looking at market research and the perspective of their clients as well, addressing questions such as the new moments that matter and what challenges and opportunities have emerged. I'll hand over to Ed and to Tim. Thank you very much, everybody.
So just a very quick introduction from me. My name is Ed, I'm Head of Consultancy at SMRS. In my role, I work with universities to help them better understand the markets in which they operate and also their audiences, so they can effectively attract and retain those students. I've been at SMRS for 5 years now, and before joining SMRS, I was Head of Marketing at the University of Hertfordshire. So there I was responsible for strategic and operational management of the central and faculty-based marketing and recruitment teams. Personally, my involvement with CASE goes back a long time now. I think the first CASE conference I went to was back in 2004, I hate to say. So a long but lovely relationship with CASE. We're really pleased to be here. I'll hand over to Tim, let him introduce himself.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here. My name's Tim. I'm Education Marketing Consultant, SMRS. In this role, I work with a number of our education clients on a whole range of projects, from strategy development and content to propensity modelling and student journeys. Before I started at SMRS about a year ago, I've worked for about a decade in senior marketing roles at the University of Cambridge and also London Business School as well. I have been to CASE before in the past when I was at Cambridge, but this is my first time presenting, so really excited to be here.
Great, thanks. So if we move on one, please. Thank you. And thanks again, Claire, for the introduction. We're obviously really pleased to be with you today, and it's the last main session of the Marketing and Comms track. So I hope you've all had the opportunity to gather plenty of new ideas over the last few weeks, and hopefully some new connections in your networks too. Certainly from my experience with CASE, that's what it's all about, is building your own professional networks. So hopefully you've had the opportunity under these circumstances to do exactly that. Now, you'll have all seen before your sessions an SMRS video that introduces us to you. So I hope you have a fair idea about what we do by now. And this session will hopefully bring some of those things to life. So I won't do the standard chat about us, but if you have any questions, and please do, of course, get in touch. So this session is all about the student journey and why having a detailed and accurate understanding of the journey is now more important than ever. So if we jump on, we'll just have a look at the agenda of what we're going to be covering. So we're going to kick off by spending some time thinking about what the student journey actually is and why it's important, and what's the best way to understand it. We'll then think about the last 9 months and the potential impact that's had on student journeys and what we should all be thinking about for the future. And then finally, we'll be sharing some of our experiences at SMRS. You should start, or could potentially start, to think about the student journey for your own institutions. So jumping on a couple of slides. There we go. So let's start off just thinking, what do we mean by the student journey? Well, from our perspective, we think it's really important to think about the entire end-to-end journey that a student has with your institution. So right from the point of initial awareness to alumni and beyond through many years. Now, you probably have ownership of part of that journey, but we think it's really important to understand what comes before you, and equally what comes after you, in order to create a quality overall student experience. So if we're thinking about the journey over that period of time, it therefore involves multiple touch points, and it's different for different people. It's a very individual journey. It also involves multiple systems, processes, and people. So from a systems perspective, obviously your content management systems, your CRM, student record systems are involved. Processes could be from making an inquiry to an application, applying for a place in accommodation, making a complaint, submitting coursework, receiving feedback. All of those are processes which are really important in that overall student journey. And then finally, the people involved in that are both internal and external. So pretty much everyone in your institution has a role to play. So professional services and academics, and also externally thinking about influencers and advisors on those individual students. So it's certainly complex, and it's therefore really hard to understand, but it's essential that we do understand the journey, and not just as a generic series of stages, or a linear funnel, or linked to application deadline, an individual's perspective. So what does a journey look like to them? And after all, our job is to satisfy customer requirements effectively. Jumping on to the next slide. But that is our job as marketers. So audience understanding is critical to developing an effective journey that will meet audience needs, and in turn will meet marketing and recruitment objectives. So with that in mind, we want to run a quick poll just to get a bit of interaction pretty early on in this session, and get an idea of where you think your challenges are when it comes to the student journey. So if we jump on, we've got a holding slide there, and Emily, if we can launch the poll. So this is around your weaknesses, and obviously only selecting one or two, completely up to you, and try not to select all of them. Try and prioritize a little bit. But in essence, what we're looking at here is, do you think your main weaknesses are around a real detailed and nuanced understanding of the audience? Is it around conversion through the journey and making sure those conversion rates are as high as possible? Is it having a comprehensive and holistic view end to end? Is it the way that you collaborate across internal teams and actually join up thinking and approaches? Is it the management information you have and understanding around performance? Or is it something around your systems and tech timetabling, for example? Okay, I didn't know what to expect here, to be honest. So conversion is 0, actually, so everyone seems pretty content, or at least maybe that's not the main issue. Really interesting though, that it's reflective of collaboration across the institution. Interesting. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to come back to some of these later on to give some thoughts on how you can start to address some of those weaknesses. So moving on a slide. So we've established that the student journey is complex and there's lots of things to understand. And clearly from what you've put forward there, one of the major complexities and issues there is probably joined up thinking across other departments. So how can you go about understanding it effectively if it's so complex? Well, ultimately, what really matters when we think about the student journey is experience. And if we can click on, please. This is going to be one of those really annoying things where I ask to click on because it just says experience. It's not really changing the slide that much. But so, when we think about experience, it's very much an individual's perspective, and we can measure it by understanding two things. So expectations and the reality of those moments. So how are those moments kind of built up in an individual's mind? What do they expect beforehand? And how does that actually feel when they're in the moment and after the moment reflecting back? So when we see significant gaps between these two things, it creates dissatisfaction and potentially weakness in the student journey. And this might present as low conversion rates, but there are other risks as well. And some of those are harder to directly quantify. So for example, it could be around positive word of mouth and recommendation. They might be fairly happy with the experience, but not enough to then go on and be true advocates of your brand. And of course, poor levels of satisfaction can add up over time as well. So if we think about the definition of customer experience, and I've not got this on a slide, but it's the sum of all experiences a consumer has with a supplier of goods or services over the duration of a relationship. So it's the sum of all of those things coming together for the entire duration. So going back to my earlier point and looking at the holistic journey, it's absolutely critical to understand what's really going on. So if we move on, I've got a very simple example here. Hopefully you can see this. The detail doesn't really matter, to be honest, but This just shows a number of touch points an individual has with an institution, and an experience rating for each touch point. So based on a kind of 5-point Likert scale. It just so happens that the lowest conversion rate, so if we click on, is at this point. And this is where most people drop out of the funnel, and it happens to be after a direct mail campaign. Now, viewed in isolation, you might conclude that this DM campaign needs looking at, it potentially needs redesigning, or potentially it just needs completely scrapping. But viewed holistically, we start to think about what led up to that point. So again, if we can click on, there are 2 other points here which have negative experiences. So what can be done to strategically fix that? And bear in mind, some of these earlier touch points might be outside of your remit. They could be contact with admissions, they could be a conversation with an academic. So the solution to fixing an issue in the pipeline that you potentially have ownership of might actually reside outside of an area you have control of. Now, I think that's really interesting when looking back at your weaknesses, that there are issues in that internal collaboration and joining up with other departments, because actually that's going to hinder delivering a really quality student experience if there's not that effective collaboration. So the culmination of experience gaps can be a problem, but what causes those gaps? And I think, it can come down to a whole range of different things, but I just want to highlight 3 which we see come up time and time again. And those are that we overpromise, we design experiences that aren't really orientated around our audience, or we potentially even completely miss the point about what drives satisfaction and therefore direct our efforts in the wrong place. So if we click on, we'll just have a look at the first one of those, and this is the overpromise. And this is ensuring everything that you say is aligned to what's delivered. So as a marketing comms team, what you do and say cannot be detached from the behaviours that are exhibited by the admissions department. It can't be detached from what it's actually like to study on a course. It has to be in complete alignment. And the image here is, I'm sure you've seen the documentary, The Fire Festival, where obviously it massively overhyped up front and the delivery was way off. And I'm not suggesting that obviously happens in HE, but to a lesser extent, it probably does because of that lack of alignment, where what we're saying in our marketing comms and how we might be setting up moments actually then won't correspond to the delivery and the actual reality of that moment. So everything needs to be aligned. And if we jump onto the next point, it follows directly on. So if we manage to align everything internally, then great, but we need to absolutely understand our audience to ensure that we're orientating what we deliver against their particular needs. Now this image is a guy using a magnifying glass looking at a bus timetable at a bus stop. Seems a bit random, but as Tim and I were putting this deck together over the last couple of weeks, I walked past a guy at a bus stop doing exactly this, and it just struck me, what a bad experience that is. How many people use the bus that, from a demographic point of view, might be elderly, might have some visual impairments, and bus timetables are tiny on the side of bus stops. How bad is that in terms of user experience? That sort of thing. Understand your audience, what their needs are, what their wants are, and make sure what you're designing, delivering aligns to those. And then the next slide, the final one of these 3 that I want to highlight is how we deal and respond to situations. So no matter how well we understand the student journey or how excellent the experiences are that we deliver to our audience, you will always get complaints and issues, but it will happen. But there's interesting research that says that actually it's not the intensity of the complaint that damages your brand, it's the satisfaction of the outcome of the complaint. So this is all about making sure you listen to your audience, and if they're telling you something, then respond to it and deal with it properly. We often talk about authenticity and the importance of it in marketing, and actually it's quite easy to get right just by properly listening to your audience and doing what you say you're going to do. So moving on, we've established, onto the next slide, sorry. We've established how to measure experience by looking at expectation versus reality. But that alone doesn't automatically mean that we'll have a positive or detrimental impact on the overall student journey. What we also need to understand is how important that moment is for the individual. So how important is it in their decision making? How important is it in shaping their views and adding value and driving loyalty and advocacy? Once we understand experience gaps and the importance of touch points, then we can bring these together in a two-dimensional map to inform decisions around how we improve the student journey and what should be prioritised. So what sits top right? What's really important, and equally what's a bad experience versus what's a bad experience but not very important? You know, we can deprioritise those things for attention. So why does all this matter? If we move on to the next slide. You know, why should you take such a forensic approach to understanding the student journey and customer experience by undertaking research and gathering all these metrics together? Well, I think if we don't, it's easy to continually focus and prioritize the big things. And by that, I mean, you know, focusing on your website, open days, campaigns, and in doing so, potentially overlook the small moments, like when a student calls admissions or when an applicant's filling out an accommodation application form. These small things could be the 1 or 2% difference that gives you market advantage, but they could also be the deterrent for a particular audience group that means they don't end up applying, and subsequently, you know, that impacts their future opportunities. You know, these are about students and real lives, and we need to make it as easy and seamless as possible for individuals to engage with us and be infused to apply and come to university and have a really fruitful time at that institution. Now, you know, thinking about that, we're a service sector after all, and there are principles that we can certainly learn from other service sectors when it comes to experience. So, namely, one of those big ones is that when selling an intangible product, seemingly insignificant tangible moments have a big impact. Now, there's a lot of research in this area, and it's mainly towards the service sector rather than, you know, kind of particularly focused on HE. But what it shows is that customers grasp the tangible moments as an indication of overall quality. And when the product's intangible, you know, they really, really grasp onto these small tangible moments. So, you know, forget if you're high ranking in league tables and you've got great performance metrics. The smallest of moments can change perception, and they therefore have a significant impact on choice. So the image here, which I'll explain now, if you take, for an example, a visit to a restaurant, a chipped wine glass would form a signal of that restaurant's quality. Seemingly really insignificant, but could have big impact. And this image is actually the first one that came up when I Googled chipped wine glass, and it was actually from TripAdvisor. So it just shows that, you know, happy customers, this is the stuff they focus on, and they will tell other people about this. Really, really small thing, but, you know, it indicated a bigger signal to that individual customer, and that will be amplified through word of mouth, through social media, whatever it might be. So moving on to the next slide, I'm just going to summarize and wrap up this section, then hand over to Tim. So I think, you know, when we think about the student journey, it's really important that we think about it from an experience perspective and as broadly as possible. So ideally from awareness through to alumni. We need to measure experience through gaps in expectation and reality, and we need to understand the importance of those touch points. And we might need to focus on the small things just as much as we do the big things. Now, talking of big things, obviously the last 9 months has been pretty big for all of us. So Tim is now going to pick up and he's going to really focus on those 9 months.